Welcome back, everyone. And I've had a number of people that have been telling me I need to do reactions to this channel called Weird History. Well, I wasn't familiar with the channel, but they've got close to 4 million subscribers, so obviously a lot of you are. So I was just browsing through the videos that they have available. There were a couple that jumped out at me, one about Buddy Holly and the day the music died, that I almost chose to do today, but I thought I'd dive into something that I know I would be familiar with, and this is their video. It's called What Was It Like to Be a Civil War Soldier? I don't know anything about their content. I don't know if it's good, bad, accurate, anything like that. So we're just going to dive right into this. As always, I'll put a link in the description to the original content should you want to check that out without my commentary or see any of their other stuff. This will be one of my last reactions before I head to Amsterdam. Tuesday afternoon, I will be headed to the airport. So looking forward to bringing that content to you. Let's go ahead and dive right into this one.
We'll put it bluntly. The life of a Civil War soldier sucked. Sure, all war is hell, but if you signed up to be a Civil War soldier, it was essentially the equivalent to signing your own death certificate.
I don't know if I'd go that far. I'd much rather be a soldier in the American Civil War than a soldier in World War I. I've mentioned this before, but I think there was nothing quite like the conditions of World War I. You had all the same disease that you have in World War I, or in the Civil War, but with the added drum roll artillery, the horrible conditions in the trenches and the mud. Slightly better medicine at that point, so you have a better chance of surviving wounds. You have a better chance of surviving diseases when they happen. But I don't know. I feel like there's worse wars to be in than the Civil War.
Today, we're exploring what life was really like to be a Civil War soldier. But before we get started, this is a good time to subscribe to our channel, Weird History. Leave us a comment or tell us what weird phenomenon, person, or event you'd like us to cover next. Now, let's go to the 1860s. Of the 2.7 million soldiers who fought in the Civil War, in over 237 named battles along with a bunch of smaller, albeit bloody face-offs and confrontations, they all weren't brawny, bearded adult men with wives and slaves back home. Approximately 420,000 were Northern boys under the age of 17, and the South had an estimated 100,000 soldiers under the age of 15. I
want to pause for just a second there. So it's fair to say that those numbers are pretty accurate. We really don't know for sure. The problem, like a lot of things, is the availability of information and the accuracy of the information. Case in point, just from my own family, I had an ancestor who I talk about all the time who was in the 20th Ohio. He was in his mid-50s when he enlisted at a time when the max age to serve was 45. So he said he was 44 when he was a good 10 years older than that. Same thing happened on the low end with the young people. We really just don't know 100% for sure because a lot of guys lied about their age. A lot of information is only as good as the records it comes from. There were no standard birth certificates that were issued for people in this time, so we can't pinpoint exactly when people were born. A lot of times they're estimates. But that's a fairly accurate number. I've seen anywhere from 250 to 400,000 were under the age of 18 when they served. Still a small percentage of the overall amount, but the vast majority of Civil War soldiers were probably under 25.
Boys weren't landowners, and they definitely didn't own slaves. As a matter of fact, it's reported that the teens on both sides of the war had neutral feelings toward slavery. The reason why these kids joined the war was simply that they wanted to escape their dull farm lives at home.
I'm really cautious about making generalizations about anybody. There were close to 3 million people who fought in this war. There were thousands of reasons why people fought. To just say, oh, well, all these guys were just trying to escape a dull farm life at home. Well, first of all, not everybody was a farmer, especially in the North. A lot of them were, but a lot of them weren't, especially in the eastern part of the northern of the Union side. They fought for patriotism. They fought to preserve the Union. They fought because they felt their homeland was being threatened, especially in the South. That was why a lot of guys enlisted, because they were being invaded by the North, and they didn't like whether they no matter how they felt about slavery, they didn't like other people coming down there and invading their homeland and telling them what to do. And so, a lot of the wealthier folks in the South, they were fighting to preserve their way of life and their slaves. That's certainly why the political leadership formed the Confederacy in the first place, was to preserve slavery. Those are all well-known things, but you can't generalize why guys fought any more than you can today. A lot of different reasons why.
Thanks to Abraham Lincoln's call for a short 90-day tour of duty, a Union soldier could enlist, put in his combat time for a few months, and then return home for accolades and a hero's welcome. What the Northern soldiers couldn't have predicted was that the Civil War was going to drag out for years. After the Union was driven out of Richmond in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, the Confederate Army began to march on to Washington. The South was starting to look like they had a chance to win this thing.
Again, I'm starting to get a little nervous about this channel, saying the South was marching on Washington after the Peninsula Campaign. They marched into Maryland, but I don't think Lee had any idea that he was going to invade Washington, D.C. itself. If he was going to do that, he wouldn't have marched north of the city. That wasn't the objective. Washington was one of the most fortified cities on earth, and Lee only had about 40,000 men when he marched into Maryland. He wasn't taking Washington, nor was he trying to.
Thanks to their Peninsula win. That's when Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 more Union soldiers with 3-year commitments. Only a fraction of those 300,000 Union soldiers would last their 3 years of brutal combat.
Again, a fraction of the soldiers lasted their 3 years? No. The casualty numbers were high, and there were a lot of men who died, especially of disease. Only about a third of them were combat wounds. But to say, you're making it sound like 80% of these guys died, and that's just not the case at all. Maybe 25% of the men who enlisted ended up dying over the course of the war. Certainly not a fraction made it through their 3 years.
How desperate were the underage boys to join the Civil War and begin living life? Well, there had been a lot of rules to get in. For example, they relied on semantics. Because the rules of combat stated that a soldier must be over 18 to join the military, an underage kid would write the number 18 on the sole of a shoe,
Sometimes.
or stuff a piece of paper with the number 18 scrawled on it, and hide it in his boot. Then when the recruiter would ask if the boy was over 18, the future war hero would technically be telling the truth by answering, "Yes, I am over 18. If that didn't work, the kids would just lie about their age because social security numbers, driver's licenses, and Spokio didn't exist. If all else failed, the teens just asked their fathers to vouch for them.
Yeah, more often than not, if you're looking for how old somebody was, you're looking at census records. And census records are horribly inaccurate. I've seen people age 3 years from one census to the next one 10 years later. Sometimes they're the exact same age in both censuses. The census records are horribly inaccurate. It's only as good as the information reported to them, and even then, sometimes they get it wrong. You didn't, like I said, have birth certificates at that time. Sometimes you had baptism records, but more often than not, the record you had was your family Bible, if you had one at all.
That said, not all teens carried arms. A lot of the kids signed up for non-combat roles, like joining the band as a drummer, flautist, or bugler. These non-combat roles also included being the kid to carry canteens, bandages, and stretchers. Some of the more skilled soldiers even assisted surgeons and nurses with the wounded and acted as a carrier pigeon by relaying orders on the battlefield.
Yep.
William Sherman coined the phrase, "War is hell," in 1879, 15 years after the Civil War, where he served as a general for the Union Army. Sherman knew a great deal about death on the battlefields because he saw a lot of it. For example, on July 1st, 1863, the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate soldiers marched onto the battlefield in straight lines toward their enemy.
Okay, wait a second. I don't understand why we go from Sherman talking about him saying Sherman saw a lot, and then we immediately jump to Gettysburg when Sherman was nowhere near Gettysburg. The only time Sherman saw combat in the East was at the first Battle of Bull Run, and then he was sent west after that. So it almost made it, maybe I'm overthinking this, but it almost makes it sound like Sherman was at Gettysburg the way he just pieced that together.
Union soldiers decimated the Confederate soldiers. According to the South's General Alfred Iverson, his soldiers died an honorable death.
And here's the other thing about the first day. We're talking about the Union soldiers decimating Confederate soldiers, but on the first day, July 1st at Gettysburg, the casualties were overwhelming in favor of the Union, or in favor of the numbers on the Union side. I think 6,000 Confederate casualties, something like 9,000 Union casualties. Union First Corps lost like 50% that day. If you want to talk about the Confederates being decimated at Gettysburg, talk about July 3rd. That was when the casualties were one-sided, with much more on the Confederate side than the Union side, but not July 1st.
They nobly fought and perished without a man running to the rear.
Now,
No
Iverson
greater
was on the
gallantry
first day.
And heroism has been displayed. The Confederate soldiers weren't as romantic about death on the battlefield as Iverson was. In fact, it sounded like they were fighting two different wars. Iverson's soldiers would recall huddling in the mud as bullets whizzed above them. One of Iverson's men described the moment when 79 of his fellow soldiers were slain in one volley. Great God, when will this stop? According to the book Hardy's Rifle and Light Infantry Tactics, soldiers from the North and South were supposed to be taken care of while issued the following: pork, bread, beef, vegetables, potatoes, peas, hominy, roasted coffee beans, sugar.
Now, Hardy was a Confederate general during the Civil War, and he had written that manual when he was in the regular army before the war.
Fortunately, both sides of the war struggled to supply their soldiers with these basic necessities. The Confederates much more than the Union. Johnny Reb rarely saw any of the aforementioned rations. Instead, the Confederate soldiers subsisted on cornbread, coffee, cigarettes, and anything they could steal. Any food the soldiers did get their hands on often became infested with insects.
And that was true on both sides, the insect problem. And for the Confederates, a lot of times they didn't have access to coffee. They had a lot of tobacco. And so that's where you get these incidents of stories of, for example, outside of Fredericksburg, between the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862 and the Battle of Chancellorsville in April and May of 1863, you've got this 3 or 4 month period where the armies are more or less in the same place for the winter. And you have Confederate and Union pickets crossing the Rappahannock River at some of the low areas, trading Confederate tobacco for Union coffee, because there was plenty of tobacco in the South and they didn't have as much coffee.
Especially rice or grain within days. All of this meant that the soldiers had to rely on their cunning to survive. Soldiers would supplement their meager rations by foraging on the land, receiving boxes of food from their families, or trading items with other soldiers, even if they traded with the enemy. Yep, it wasn't uncommon for Union soldiers to trade their coffee with the Confederate soldiers in exchange for tobacco away from the eyes of their officers. Civil War soldiers didn't have much of a chance to live if they were seriously wounded in battle. Picture it. You're keeping the enemy at bay by shooting one round every 20 to 30 seconds. But as you pack your musket with gunpowder, you get hit in the stomach by enemy fire. In the 1860s, injured Civil War soldiers on both sides had to just sort of lie on the grassy knoll and play dead where they were shot in the hopes of an ambulance wagon coming by and tending to their wounds.
Now, like in any war, you had your own comrades would try to get you back to the rear. It wasn't just that you laid there and waited, though a lot of times that did happen if you died in an area that ended up between the lines. But yeah, an abdominal wound, stomach wound, pretty much a death sentence. The problem was, if you've ever held a Civil War round, like a mini ball or anything like that, the lead's really soft. You can squeeze it with your hand and smash it. It's that soft. It's not like a modern bullet by any means. And so it was fired at a low velocity. It was soft lead. And so the minute it hit your body, it flattened and it kind of tumbled around like bullets do, and it just destroyed everything it hit. And it usually stayed there. And so then infection is a thing, and you don't have antibiotics. An abdominal wound is a death sentence because they just can't really do anything for you there. A limb wound, basically the bone just is gone. If you get hit in the arm or the leg, it's just going to shatter that bone. There's no way to fix that. That's why amputation was such a common thing, plus the fact that they couldn't deal with infection. That's all part of it.
If they were lucky, they had a flask full of sipping whiskey to numb the pain from the hole in their belly. If these soldiers were extra lucky, a horse-drawn ambulance wagon would come by with medical supplies and patch them up.
Now, the idea, I should mention too, that all of these guys had their limbs amputated while wide awake and just had to bite the bullet or bite a stick. That did happen, but they things available like ether, for example. So at the start of a battle, at least, they could generally knock you out. Stonewall Jackson was out cold when they amputated his arm. So certainly for officers especially, but in these larger battles, they didn't have nearly enough of that to go around. And so by the end of the battle, you're out of any of that kind of stuff. So now you're dealing with having to have whiskey or bite down on a stick, things like that.
Ambulance wagon wasn't able to reach a wounded soldier out on the battleground. They would most likely perish. We're not going to sugarcoat it. Getting shot by the enemy with the Springfield Model 1861 musket was bad. But you know what was worse? Disease. The thing is, you might have lived if you were shot, but if you got sick, caught a disease, or developed an infection during what's been called the bloodiest war in American history, you were as good as dead. To put it in perspective, the Union suffered the loss of 44,000 lives from dysentery and diarrhea. To put it in perspective, the Union suffered the loss of 44,000 lives from dysentery. That's the equivalent of 10 Gettysburg battles.
I'm a little confused by that. I need to go back and listen to that again. I felt like he repeated himself.
Lives from dysentery and diarrhea. To put it in perspective, the Union suffered the loss of 44,000 lives from dysentery.
Yeah, I kind of said the same thing there. I'm a little confused by that. I don't know if that was a mistake or what. But no, I mean, yeah, 2/3 of the death. Modern estimates are somewhere around 750,000 died in the Civil War. I don't know. Almost 500,000 of that was disease, 2/3. You were much more likely to die of disease than you were from battle wounds. But again, he's making this sound like if you got sick, you were dead. Everybody got sick. The vast majority of men who served in Civil War units came home with something. A lot of them died in the years after the war. You just look through their pension files. All of these guys came back with rheumatism or with consumption, which is tuberculosis, or with some nagging cough that never went away for the rest of their lives. But a lot of them survived.
That's the equivalent of 10 Gettysburg battles. More men died from disease than anything else during the Civil War. Union Private Theodore Garish wrote this of the Civil War conditions he faced. One of the most disastrous features of the gloomy situation was the terrible sickness of the soldiers. Men were unused to the climate, the exposure, and the food, so that the whole experience was in direct contrast to their life at home. Infection was a major problem because doctors didn't sterilize equipment. During the course of the conflict in its entirety, hospital workers performed amputations on 60,000 men, with at least 1 in 4 dying from infection. We all remember why the Civil War happened, right? What we don't understand is how they thought black Americans were going to help and pitch in to destroy the Union. Because the Confederates were rightly concerned about arming their slaves, Southern black men were enlisted mostly for camp labor. The closest the Confederacy came to recruiting slaves to the ranks came in the last few desperate weeks of the war. In fact, when the Union began enlisting black soldiers, Confederate President Jefferson Davis declared that captured black soldiers would either be enslaved or executed.
Yep.
When a Confederate general suggested enlisting slaves, Confederate leaders scoffed. On March 13, 1865, the Confederate Congress allowed black soldiers to enlist, without promising their freedom after the conflict ended.
And that was desperation. By that point, the war was effectively over. Robert E. Lee had been kind of encouraging this for a while at that point, but again, it was all desperate. They were never going to arm slaves if they had any other choice in the matter whatsoever.
The desperate move made no difference. The war would be over less than a month later. As a Civil War soldier, if you weren't firing your musket at the face of your enemy on the battlefield or sleeping, you were running drills with your troop. Soldiers spent a majority of their waking hours preparing for active conflict by cleaning their firearm and learning drills and combat formations, with the occasional stint at guard duty or a long march. Private Theodore Garish of the Union explained how unprepared soldiers were at the very start of the war. We had never been drilled. An untrained drum corps furnished us with music. Each musician kept different time, and each man in the regiment took a different step. We marched, ran, walked, galloped, and stood still in our vain endeavors to keep step.
So yeah, think about this. Fort Sumter's fired on in late April of 1861. 2 months later, you've got armies starting to mobilize and move into position. 3 months after Fort Sumter's fired on, you have the first major battle, with the first battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. And these armies, they weren't armies. Compare that to World War II, where you have a group like the 506th PIR, the guys from Band of Brothers, who trained for 2 years before they dropped into Normandy. 2 years. These guys, most of them had been in the Army for like a month, and most of them hadn't had much training. Most of them are being led by officers who were elected because they enlisted at the same time. You know, if you had a company of soldiers, if you were lucky, your company was led by a guy right out of West Point who had no combat experience whatsoever, but at least had some military training, if you were lucky. A lot of these companies and even regiments were commanded by guys who had never been in the military 3 months earlier, who had helped raise a company of soldiers, who had been a lieutenant before the war and now was finding himself a colonel in command of a brigade. So yeah, the first Battle of Bull Run's a complete disaster, and that's why you don't really see any major combat. After the first Battle of Bull Run, when's the next major battle that takes place? It's like 8 months later. So after that first battle, everybody knew there were skirmishes and things like that, but everybody knew that they had to train and prepare their armies.
If you were a black soldier and you proved yourself reputable, discrimination in pay was still par for the course in the early 1860s, even if you were defending the Union. Unfortunately, the Union didn't enlist black soldiers until 1862, but recruitment grew further after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863.
People forget that. People always talk about the 54th Massachusetts, but that was not the first black regiment. There was the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment, who my friend JD just did a great video from the location of their battle at Jenkins Ferry in Arkansas, which was fantastic, by the way. You should check it out on the History Underground. There were units in Louisiana and Mississippi that were being recruited during the Vicksburg campaign. But the 54th Massachusetts gets a lot of the press because it was one of the first that was authorized after the Emancipation Proclamation.
And while they were getting paid, according to the Militia Act of 1862, black privates were still getting paid a lot less for equal work. Black soldiers received $10 a month with a $3 optional clothing deduction, while in comparison, white privates started at $13 a month and received a clothing allowance of $3.50.
And you see that famous scene in the movie Glory where the men line up to receive pay and they find out they're being paid less, and so they all tear up their vouchers for their pay. And eventually black soldiers did get equal pay, but it took a lot of lobbying and a lot of fighting to make that happen. But the Civil War is hardly unique in black soldiers being treated like second-class citizens. It happened in the Army for 100 years after that or more. I mean, World War I, look at the Harlem Hellfighters, treated terribly by the American Army. Army didn't even want to use them. Even in World War II, you've got black sailors being used as cooks and orderlies and things like that, rather than giving the same opportunities for combat.
If you were one of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the front lines, stuffing your musket with bullets and gunpowder and firing every 20 seconds, if you were fast, there's a good chance your arms were useless by the end of the day.
Yeah.
The rifled muskets that soldiers on both sides used weighed up to 10 pounds, and they would recoil with such force, just firing the thing could put your arm out of commission.
Yep.
Confederate Private Sam R. Watkins described the experience. After undressing, I found my limb all battered and bruised and bloodshot from my wrist to my shoulder, and as sore as a blister. I had shot 120 times that day.
So yeah, people think about, most soldiers went into combat with 60 rounds, but they, a lot of times in these battles that went on for a while, they got a lot of resupply during the battle. And Company H, which was Sam Watkins' diary that he kept during the war, it's AYTCH, Company H, like that. He was in the 1st Tennessee, one of the best works of writing to come out of the American Civil War. Fantastic stuff.
These muskets also regularly overheated, making them hard to reload. Watkins continued, "My arm became so hot that frequently the powder would flash before I could ram home the ball, and I had frequently to exchange my arm for that of a fallen comrade." We forgot to mention one thing that soldiers did when they weren't fighting, sleeping, or cleaning the rifle. They read and wrote like it was going out of style. It was really important for soldiers to read everything they could get their hands on and write to their loved ones as often as possible. The soldiers struggled to describe the horrors of the conflict in their letters home. Many thought,
for the ones who could read or write. Let's remember, not everybody could. In fact, I want to look at the statistics on that. So the United States Census actually kept track of literacy. They would ask the question, can you read, can you write? And of adults in 1860 in the United States Census, in northern white adults, 97% were literate. Southern white adults, it was 56%. My own personal experience in doing research makes me feel like those numbers are a little high. I saw a lot of, even like steel workers, a lot of them could not read or write. Some of them maybe into their 30s and 40s before they could. Farmers, a lot of them couldn't read or write.
Thought they could not relate their experiences to civilian audiences, but some tried. Charles Carroll Maury, a captain for the Union, described one skirmish in stark terms. Soon after we arrived on the ground, we were firing, and just after I had discharged my piece at a Johnny's head, I turned to reload. I saw a Reb who had got sight of me across his musket, and I can assure you my legs grew very short in a very short space of time, or else there was a joint in them. That is to say, I dropped down out of his sight just in time to hear his bullet whistle over my head. Then, knowing the danger had passed, I straightened up and finished loading. Maury felt lucky to be alive, writing, "I don't know what to say first, but we'll say praise God for his goodness in sparing my life while so many of our brave comrades have fallen victims to the enemy's shots." So what do you think? Would you want to be a...
All right, I don't know, kind of a mixed bag with that one for me. I feel like it was well put together. I thought it was a little misleading, but maybe for somebody who's just learning about the Civil War for the first time, it might be okay. But for somebody like me who knows a lot about that conflict, I feel like it could have been better researched, I guess. But let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. If there's a particular video of theirs that you think's really good and I should check out, let me know, and I'll do that sometime in the near future. Thanks for watching.